it's a pleasure to be here. I'll try not to talk fast because I'm a little nervous. But I'm here to talk today about states' rights and state flags, how constitutional regime change influenced state flags. Now, that's a lot of words, but I'm particularly interested in state flags. It's what I find the most fascinating because, as we all know, flags are symbols. They're symbols of history, they're symbols of values, they're symbols of culture. And I think state flags in particular reflect uniquely on American history. So today, it's not going to be a deep dive into all 50 state flags. That would take way too long. It's going to be more of a 10,000-foot view of a data point that I find very interesting and I would love to research further in the future. State flags represent people and ideas. Here are the flags of the 50 states. I believe that state flags are heavily influenced by the Civil War, and I have some graphs later that I think will show that. But it's very interesting to see how American history, and particularly the Civil War and Reconstruction, shaped the creation of American state flags. And I believe it had a lot to do with changes in constitutional regime change, basically how we view the Constitution, that happened directly after the Civil War. And basically, why do we have state flags is the question I am trying to answer in this presentation. I first started by looking up when the states became states. So this is a graph. I believe I went to Wikipedia or some internet source and just plotted by decade how many states became states in every decade. And it's very interesting to see. You obviously have a lot at the beginning in the late 1700s, and then it kind of peters out until the 1910s. And then you have Alaska and Hawaii in the 50s. So now I made a second graph. I looked at mostly Whitney Smith's book, The History of the United States State Flags, and I looked up the history of each state flag. And I plotted when the states first adopted their flags. Now, this is not when the states first designed their flags. Some designs existed for years, especially in regimental form. But this is when the state legislature first said, we need a state flag, and we are going to officially adopt it as such. Now, in the 1830s and 1840s, there was one state in each decade. Those are Texas and Hawaii, or no, not Texas and Hawaii, I'm sorry, Texas and Florida. And then most of the states got their state flags beginning in about 1860, 1861 through the 1920s, and then Alaska and Hawaii in 1950. If you overlay these graphs on top of one another, it's very clear to see that when states became states doesn't really match up with when states got their flags, which made me very interested because what could have caused this shift? So you can really see just how it doesn't line up on this flag. So I turned to research skills that I've been hopefully learning in college. And I looked as many places as I could, and there was really only one place that talked about why states have state flags, and that was Whitney Smith's book. And he has, here's just a quick excerpt, I'll read it. The United States fought only one major war, the Spanish-American, in the period between 1865 and 1917, and the need for military colors was correspondingly low. At the same time, the spread of wealth and industry, the pushing back of the frontier, and the growth of urbanization, literacy, and communications all contributed to the increased national self-awareness. The desire for a general purpose state flag, vaguely felt at first, gained impetus from such things as the building of state capitals and the participation of individual states in fairs and exhibitions. Now, I think all of these are definitely factors in why many states got flags, but I think there's one thing that is missing: states' rights. And that plays into constitutionality and the Civil War. So my theory or my thing is states' rights was also a factor in the creation and adoption of state flags. If you look, for example, at the flag of Virginia, South Carolina, and Connecticut, all three of those are states that were originally 13 colonies that got their statehood in the late 1700s. None of them adopted flags until the Civil War, and all three were directly connected with the beginning of the Civil War. And it's just very interesting to see how they waited so long until the late 1800s. Now I'm going to get a little bit more into the weeds of some other stuff I get nerdy about, constitutional history. And I'm going to talk a little bit about Bruce Ackerman and theories of constitutional change. Now, I'll spare you all of the details and I'll focus mainly on the era of constitutional change that happened in the late 1800s. There have been 4 major shifts. The second happened in the late 1800s with Reconstruction, and particularly state versus federal power. Now, for all of American history, states have been very important. When the Declaration of Independence was signed, it did not create the United States of America, but rather 13 free and independent states. It wasn't until the Articles of Confederation that we got the United States as we know it, or even the Constitution. But states have always played a large factor, which is why it's so interesting that they did not have state flags as when they became independent, or why they didn't create them as such. Most states got flags. Many of the southern states got flags when they seceded from the Union at the beginning of the Civil War as a symbol that they were no longer a part of the Union. The Civil War really it dealt with the issue of slavery, yes, but also the issue of states' rights, of whether a state had the right to leave the United States or not. The southern states essentially asserted that they had that right and acted as such, creating their own state flag and then later the national flag of the Confederacy. But after the Civil War, every state continued to fly flags. The thing is, after the Civil War, things didn't stay the same constitutionally. Now, the big constitutional change that happened after the Civil War happened partially from an understanding that the states did not have the right to secede from the Union, but also from increased power to the federal government through specifically the 14th Amendment. The 14th Amendment is one of the first constitutional amendments that changed the relation of federal and state power. Instead of the states protecting the people from the government, the 14th Amendment made it so that the federal government was protecting people from the states. So this was kind of a constitutional, Bruce Ackerman describes it as a constitutional regime change that that happened during this time. So with the 14th Amendment passed in the late 1800s, states had significantly fewer rights. And this as such corresponded with the shift in American state flags. And I believe it has a great factor where the states are saying, we may not have as much power constitutionally, we may not be independent nations, however, we are able to proclaim our statehood and our identity through another means, flags. And they use, if you look, it's a lot of, in the southern states, there was and still is some element of Confederate imagery. I'm looking at Georgia, the old Mississippi flag, North Carolina, Arkansas uses some of those symbols. And many of the northern states use blue with seals, which was also the Union's battle flag. And so you can see that heavy correlation generally in the designs themselves. And you can also see it in this graph where states waited, not when they got their independence, but when during the Civil War, they decided we are our own unit, and as such, we are going to create our own state flags. Now, this brings up an interesting point today, where we kind of see a new wave of flag redesigns, I think in large part due to increased awareness of vexillology generally. But I also hope that in some ways it sparks change and that we turn to our state governments, because our nation is very polarized today. And one of the greatest ways that we can conquer future challenges is unity. And what better way to be unified than under a great state flag? I hope that as more states, I'm from Minnesota, I hope that as Minnesota gets its new flag and all the other states, that as they get new flags, design them, create them, claim them as their own, I hope and pray that it will some ways inspire unity within people of their own states, that they will be able to unite together and solve their problems together and not as divided citizenry. Anywho, that is what I have to say. Thank you so much. Any questions of why there was an increase in the early 1900s? Yes, so I believe that some of that was just bandwagon effect, as some states got flags being like, we are going to show our statehood pride. As some states got flags, other states may have felt left out and got some of their own flags. I think that might have been a factor. During the Civil War was fought from 1861 to 1865. So in 1861, when a lot of southern states seceded from the Union, they adopted the flags. I would have to go back into the data, but it's majority.
It's not so much a question, but a comment. Josh Hodges, I had never made that correlation before, but none of the states that were in the Confederacy have seal on bed sheets. Louisiana is the closest.
That's an interesting comment. I would like to point out that Virginia has a seal on a bedsheet flag that hasn't changed since about 1861 when they adopted it. I collected this data by looking at when states officially adopted flags as states. So I believe Alaska and Hawaii, I believe there was some kind of thing that they adopted their territory flags as their state flags, which is why you see it as 1950. That is actually a very excellent question. The progressive era is actually another big constitutional shift where you see the federal government gaining more state power. So I think that definitely could be a factor, just as well as you see a lot of states already having flags and other states wanting to, our neighbor has a flag, we also want a flag. The question was about the West Virginia flag and how it was designed in the middle of the Civil War. I don't think I encountered that specifically, or if I did, it was a while ago and I don't remember. But I believe if West Virginia became a state and officially adopted their flag during the Civil War, I would have plotted it in the 1860 bracket. The comment was about charting when states became states, the time between when the state became a state and when they got a flag. That would be very interesting to look at. I know, like, you have states like the original colonies, Connecticut, Virginia, South Carolina, that didn't get flags till the late 1800s. And you have states like Minnesota, who I know their history the best, which is why I keep using it as an example. We became a state in 1859 and got our flag, I think, in the mid 1880s. 1893. Thank you, Lee. I forgot, unfortunately. But I think it's probably, I don't know how much of a correlation there is. It'd be interesting to look regionally for the 13 original colonies, maybe more of the Midwest, the West, that kind of thing. The comment was about the Massachusetts flag and how it was used informally before it was adopted in the late 1800s. And yeah, I agree. There's a lot of states that did that had unofficial flags before they officially adopted it. The reason I looked at official adoption of the state flag as itself is because it shows something about the attitude of the government at that time and the people and the culture to say, this is the time when we are going to actually take action and officially adopt our state flag.